Dictatorial power can only come about when the ruler has both the power to make the law and to enforce it. Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin all achieved this total authority, resulting in staggering bloodshed. Our unique British Constitution prevents such unification of power taking place. Some vital principles of our Constitution are the right to jury trial, the right of habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence, the right to silence, no taxation without representation, no cruel and unusual punishments. All these principles and others are at the core of our Constitution and integral to our liberty, with a separation of powers as the safeguarding mechanism at its heart. It is entirely different from the continental system of administration and the proposed EU Constitution, where nothing is allowed unless the law permits. Our ancient Constitution determines that the duty of our politicians is to maintain our liberty. Liberty is the norm in Britain and is only constrained by the law. We British are free to do anything unless the law prohibits. The British Constitution has prevented the worst excesses of tyranny or despotism for centuries. Why should we wish to exchange this for a system which supports the unelected, the irremovable and the unaccountable? The imposition of the EU Constitution will mean the end of the British Constitution, and along with it will go all the protections we have enjoyed for centuries, including our right and our children's right of self-determination.
In addition to bringing about the end of our unique British form of freedom, the EU Constitution transfers significant political power to Brussels. This, together with the combined losses brought about by the 5 treaties, means that the British people will no longer be free to govern themselves. We are close to the end game. But the EU Constitution, we were informed, could only be implemented if all 25 countries ratified it. Christopher Booker has been examining whether or not that condition has been observed and what the EU Constitution really means.
It was in the late 1990s that the political leaders of the European Union began to talk about the need to give Europe a constitution. For decades, they had been proceeding with their plan to assemble a supranational government for Europe by stealth. But they had got so far, they now felt, that concealment was no longer necessary. If the United States had a constitution, so should the new United States of Europe. In 2002, delegates from 25 countries met for 15 months in Brussels to draft the new constitution, very much guided by their chairman, Giscard d'Estaing, the former president of France. It then took their governments another year to agree on the final text, this huge document here. The original American Constitution had just 7 articles. This Constitution for Europe contains 448, which originally covered 800 pages. In some ways, this constitution is just another treaty because it incorporates all the earlier treaties, but it makes the intention to set up a European government much more obvious than ever before. It gives the European Union, the Union as they now call it, pretty well all the attributes of a fully fledged state, with its own flag, its own currency, its own foreign and defence policies, its own courts and legal officers, its own federal police force. It gives the Union for the first time its own legal personality, with the right to behave on the international stage just like any sovereign government. It recognises for the first time in a treaty the principle that the laws of the Union are superior in every respect to those made by national parliaments and courts. It marks a further massive handing over of powers from national governments to the central government in Brussels. It greatly extends the areas of life where Brussels has the power to dictate policies and laws. It also reduces almost to vanishing point the right of national governments to veto laws which they do not consider in their country's interests. It includes all the 54 articles of the so-called Charter of Fundamental Rights, the document which we were told by a British minister would have no more legal significance than a copy of the Sun newspaper or the Beano. What this document confirms, in short, is the desire to set up a supranational government which is not elected and which the peoples of Europe cannot call to account or dismiss. It marks the transformation of Europe, in effect, into a one-party state. Yet this is what the governments of Europe agreed to in our name in 2004. Only in 2005, when it was rejected by the voters of France and Holland, did the plan to impose this constitution on us all at last run into a mighty obstacle. For the moment, it has been put on ice, but there are plenty of people at the top in Europe who are looking for ways to bring it back onto the agenda. Meanwhile, they are already pushing ahead with many of its contents, from a European space programme to a common defence policy, just as if their constitution was already legally in force. They are not going to give up.
The EU constitution sweeps up those few areas of governmental power that still, just about, remain British. But what about our economy? Whoever controls the currency controls the country, and at the moment we still have our own currency, the pound sterling. Signing up to the EU constitution would undoubtedly increase the pressure on Britain to enter the single currency. This would mean Britain's economy being controlled by the foreign bankers of the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Ian Milne has been looking at EU economics.
There's a huge misconception that the EU political economic model represents the future. Big mistake. Let me explain. The EU model is copied nowhere in the developed world. The relatively few customs unions that do exist are in poor African and Latin American countries, former Soviet satellites, and some of the Gulf states. But outside Europe, no major industrial trading nation, not the USA, not Japan, not South Korea, not Singapore, not Australia, not Chile, has chosen to conduct its trade via an EU-type customs union and single market. Neither, and here's the killer fact, have tomorrow's economic giants, China and India. All have chosen user-friendly, light-touch, government-to-government arrangements. That's the future, trade-wise. The claim that the UK needs the EU for its trade and jobs is an empty one. Over 90% of the UK economy is not involved in exporting to the EU. The USA, not in the EU, sells more to the EU than the UK does, without paying a penny to Brussels or imposing 1 ounce of EU regulation on the US economy. The UK has a huge and growing deficit on its trade with continental Europe, and the cost of UK membership of the EU massively outweighs the benefit. British access to the 6% of the world's population living in the EU costs us a fortune. The Treasury hands over £250 million of our taxes to Brussels every single week. British access to the other 94% of the world's population outside the EU is free. The fact is, the EU is the past, invented in the 1950s to meet the failures of the 1930s. But in tomorrow's world, it'll soon be an irrelevance, overshadowed by the USA, China and India, all of which, as it happens, conduct their business in English. Those are the countries we have to be free to engage with, as equals, to build a better world in the 21st century. It's time this country got out and embraced the future.